I'm wondering how we want to think about the forces, the internal to the West forces that we're fighting against. Do we think of them as they present themselves as furthering the Western principles of reason? And I'll avert to Tariq's contrast between mind-numbing certainties and supreme self-criticism. All right, in Ibn Warraq's talk, supreme self-criticism is what the West is all about. Mind-numbing certainties are what traditional societies are all about. So what is going on when a feminist or ethnic studies or a Marxist movement or course takes place in the academy today? Is that supreme self-criticism? Well, that's the way these courses present themselves. We're taking Western principles of liberty and equality, and we're criticizing the West on the basis of those very principles. This is an act of rational self-criticism. It's exactly what the West is all about. Or is that, on the other hand, as I think Paul was implying, an act of radical will? Or as someone else might call it, a secular religion of sorts? Or is it a bit of both, and is that our problem? How exactly do we see the kind of courses on race, class, and gender that we heard about at the conference from the standpoint of what we've spoken about at the conference today? Because you can argue it easily from either side, and certainly the courses themselves that we're concerned with present themselves as a continuation of the West's tradition of supreme self-criticism. So how do we handle the problem or paradox of that? Sure.
Well, I think they're a bit of both. How do you keep academic discourse or any kind of discourse healthy? You have a particular situation in the natural sciences in which results are quantifiable, in which experimental procedures are very specifiable, and hence tests can be replicated. You can look at somebody's finding, you can do the same thing, you can see if it turns out the same way. Most of the natural sciences, we've heard about a few exceptions earlier today, but most of the natural sciences are not wrapped up in political struggles. Egos are on the line, but there is a way of sometimes reaching dispositive conclusions. Much harder to do that in the realm of humanism and even in the realm of the social sciences. So what keeps things honest there, particularly as in those realms, findings are very much wrapped up and sometimes feed very quickly into larger political discourse in which there are very palpable and important stakes involved. The only way I think you can try to do that as best one can, and hence keep what starts as criticism from degenerating into polemic and propaganda and cultivation of constituencies, etc., is to have a lively pluralism in which ideas come up against ideas, in which people with one set of ideas, even in an institutional framework like the university, can't coerce those who differ with them into agreeing with them, but actually have to persuade. When Paul was talking about the ancient Greek polities and how they managed to develop an ethos of reason, I think probably what was very significant, at least, in bringing that about, was that resources were fairly evenly distributed in polities, certainly more so than in despotic states, and hence, if you wanted to get someone to do what you wanted, certainly if you wanted to move the polity in the direction you favored, you had to persuade them. And hence you had to think about what made for effective persuasion, and hence you had to think about how you showed things were true and why they were true, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you need that kind of environment in the university, and I don't think the institutional structures of our contemporary universities are terribly well suited to that. I don't want to then go into a long discourse as to how I think they might be reshaped. But I think one of the problems is that it is easy for intellectual factions in our universities to gain dominance and to snuff out, so to speak, professionally speaking, opinions that they don't like, rather than engage them, take them on, and engage in fruitful interactions. So I think that's part of our difficulty in academia.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
It's up to you.
Is this on?
We have plenty of questions.
Sorry, very quickly. No, self-criticism, of course, can lead and does lead in the West to self-loathing, but that's because one's criticism tends to be partial, and there are far too many taboo subjects in the academy at the moment, in the American and Western universities generally. Taking the case of slavery, of course, it was self-criticism which helped us to eradicate this, but this is not the case in other civilizations. Every single civilization that's been known to man has had slavery, but it was the West which took steps to abolish it. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, and this is a taboo subject, and anybody who's talked about it has been drummed out of the university, like the French Olivier Petro-Grenouille, who wrote a searing indictment of Arab slavery, Islamic slavery, which in terms of numbers was far greater and started much earlier and went on much longer. So there is, we need to teach, this is one kind of relativism which I'm in favor of. If you compare the Islamic imperialism with Western imperialism, Islamic slavery with Western slavery and so on, you might get some sort of a balance.
All right, and here's another question. Does Enlightenment inquiry, even in ideal form, lead to growth and strength, or doubt and decadence? Are the benefits of secular rationalism overstated?
That's a very good question, and let's put it this way. The Enlightenment is a lot more complicated than we like to think it is. Immanuel Kant is part of the Enlightenment. What's he doing? He's trying to carve out a space for human freedom in an Epicurean world, in a world of Newtonian physics. He's trying to bring together modern physics, which is, if not at the metaphysical level, at least at the speculative level, Epicurean in character, matter in motion and nothing else, with the fact that there's an observer of this physical world and trying to make sense of this. So he carves out a kind of space that puts him at odds with the kind of vision of man that you get in Thomas Hobbes. So it seems to me that within Enlightenment rationalism, there's considerable variety. There are those in the Enlightenment who prefer absolute monarchy because it will allow rational administration. It will allow the wise philosophers at the top to control the lives of everyone else in fine detail. Turgot is such a figure. And there are others, such as Montesquieu, who are horrified by that vision and who are persuaded that trial and error within free societies where discussion takes place is a much better way of conducting affairs. So the answer is what we think of as the Enlightenment there's a lot inside that crucible. And there are parts of it that point on to rationalist despotism of, say, the Marxist sort, of the Leninist sort. And there are parts that point on to something like the American Constitution, checks and balances, federalism, and so forth.
I'd say the answer to that question is we don't know, and it remains to be seen.
All right, here's another question, an excellent one. Ibn Warraq regards the fact that people in the West can define their own meaning as one of the West's gains. Paul Ray sees it as a part of the corruption of modernity. Is there a disagreement?
I'll let
I'll let you answer this time.
Yes, when I say we can define our own, give our lives our own meaning, it does not mean that anything goes. Certainly not. We can argue for our positions, but I'm free. But I'm not free to hit you on the head because I have to. There are constraints, and that depends on the values generally that we develop as socially in a society. The predominant values do shape our choices. So we have to create a certain climate where, to a large extent, we are free, but we also have to develop notions of civic responsibility, which does not mean that you can do whatever you want.
That suggests that we're in agreement.
Well, we solved that one. Okay, this one is directed to Ibn Warraq, but I think anyone can answer it as well. It's another of the deeper questions. Are human rights truly universal? Do they not require a psychology specific to the West? If so, what is that psychology?
Well, I do think they are universal, and this is one of the things which depress those in the non-Western world who are fighting for the same rights as we are. It's the thing that depresses them the most is that they're not taken as equals with the Western, that they're not treated as human beings. In other words, there's a certain condescension, meaning that you're a non-Westerner, you cannot possibly handle freedom. You will have to live with your own tribal laws. But one of the most gratifying, one of the most positive things that came out of about 3 years ago, when there was a resolution which was pushed through the United Nations by the Islamic countries, which effectively wanted to curtail freedom of expression, and specifically they wanted to curtail any criticism of religion, meaning, of course, Islam. But there were 17 NGOs from Islamic countries who voted against it. They were in favor of freedom of expression. So they obviously wanted the same kind of values, same kind of freedoms that we enjoy, that we take for granted. So no, I think it is far more moral and ethical to treat everybody as equal and not dismiss the 2/3 of humanity because they don't live up to our notions of human rights.
All right, we're going to come back a little closer to curricular issues, although it's all tied together. Can the case be made that it is impossible to understand other cultures before understanding your own?
Well, I think it kind of works both ways. I don't think it's entirely possible to understand your own culture unless you have some understanding, at least, of others. Now, practically speaking, there's only so much time and space in a curriculum, and you can't communicate everything. But having some sense of context is really what allows you to see the way in which a particular culture is distinct, or the way in which it expresses some commonality that applies to all mankind. I think you want to begin in anywhere in the world, certainly in the Western world, with Western civilization for the reasons that I alluded to. But I'd be very much in favor. As I say, I'm in favor of more substance in the curriculum. I think there's plenty of room, given the vacuity of the curriculum that's been created over the last few decades, to put more substance in it. I would be in favor of teaching about Western civilization in a comparative context. The priority is on understanding the world-changing West, but understanding it by understanding what other human achievements have been like and how they are either like or different from that of the West.
Let me second that. It seems to me that one never learns English very well unless one learns a foreign language. That one of the reasons that college students today are so poor in their writing is that they've never learned English grammar because they've never learned Latin grammar. And once you see the way a sentence is put together in Latin or German or French or Greek, you'll never mistake an adverb for an adjective. You will know all the parts of speech and how they work because you've had to learn them with the foreign language, and it will improve your use of your own language. It seems to me that the same thing is true with regard to studying an alien civilization. And let me add, within Western civilization, one of the reasons to study the Greeks and the Romans is they're pagans. It's a different kind of world. It's similar in certain ways to ours, but the contrast is as important for understanding things as are the similarities. And something more radically different, for example, Chinese history, seems to me to be extraordinarily useful for the light it throws on our own history, and vice versa. We learn by comparing things, noting similarities, and noting differences. Okay, if you don't encounter differences, you don't know about them. And we can no longer take the grand tour and go to ancient Egypt. It's gone, but we can study it. We can no longer take the grand tour and go to ancient Persia the way Herodotus did, but we can study it. And I think that's extremely useful.
As an anthropologist, I am the last person to criticize studying other cultures, but I really do rather like that rationale for having Western Civ courses and for giving them priority in time. Just about every lens we use to study other cultures is developed from some Western theory or movement or other, same sort of thing that Steve was talking about. And you understand and appreciate that so much better if you do your Western study before you go and study other cultures. It doesn't have to be exclusive, and really you can always start from any part of the direction. But if I were designing a curriculum, I would put Western civilization up front before the study of other cultures, because I think you need to understand yourself before you see others. But of course, an argument can be made in both directions. Ultimately, it's all complementary. All right, wasn't the NAS formed to counter the trends we have discussed here? What is the assessment? Did the NAS succeed in slowing down the destruction of the universities?
Peter, why don't you answer that? Before coming here, I was part of the Stanley Rothman sort of memorial symposium. And I remember, I kind of recounted this story there. I was sitting with Stan Rothman sometime in the 1990s, early 1990s, and telling him about all the initiatives. This was shortly after he became chairman. Maybe it was the later part of the 1990s. Telling him about all the initiatives, and he kind of listened and he nodded. He wished them all well, and he was advising me upon them. But then he said, but the culture is moving so heavily in the other direction. It had a lot of weight, particularly coming from him. I think we have performed a holding action to some extent, a preservative action, keeping ideals alive that might have entirely been squelched. I think that we're kind of looking forward to a day when what we advocate will receive or reach a more attentive audience, perhaps because the failures of what other people are advocating have become more palpable. I wish I could say that we had won most of the battles we entered into. We did, I think, do a very good constructive work with respect to race preferences. We have victories to point to there, and with respect to program creation. But the culture has moved very heavily against us. The big battalions were and still on the other side. Chuck Barson once said that people are most apt to believe what they hear over and over and over again. And we know where those choruses are and the notes they sound. So I'm proud of what we've done and what we'll continue to do, but we're working in a pretty adverse environment.
And on that note, we'll bring this panel to a close, but not yet the conference. Peter Wood is going to come up and have a few words to say to you.